How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so Fyodor Dostoevsky and Leo Tolstoy are, of course, giants of world literature. And if you didn't know much about them, you might take them to be pretty similar. I mean, both of them were Russian, both lived through the political turbulence of the 19th century. And in terms of literary content, both of them wrestled with the deepest of human questions, like those concerning faith and suffering and meaning. Yet, when you look closer, they're pretty different, especially when it comes to how they see the human soul and the road to salvation. But before I get to the differences, let me first say something about what it is that they have in common. So very generally, I think it's uncontroversial to say that both Dostoevsky and Tolstoy saw life as a kind of battlefield of the spirit. They believed that modern society was in trouble, that it was corrupt and in decay, that it had lost its way both morally and spiritually. And also, both writers believe that a life without meaning, specifically without some connection to a higher good, would lead not just to unhappiness, but to despair and to destruction and to violence. And there's another important similarity too, and this one has to do not with the content of their writings, but with themselves as individuals. So both of them were master psychologists, long before psychology was even recognized as a science. That's to say, they both had this incredible ability to peel back the polite masks that people wear and show the trembling selves underneath, full of love and guilt and pride and longing, full of chaos and full of contradiction. And this ability they had, it hasn't gone unnoticed by other great writers and thinkers. I mean, for example, Sigmund Freud called Dostoevsky a great psychologist, especially when it came to his understanding of father-son dynamics. And see Dostoevsky's great later work, The Brothers Karamazov, for that. And then there was Nietzsche. So the German philosopher likewise said of Dostoevsky that he was the only psychologist from whom I had anything to learn. And Virginia Woolf and Isaiah Berlin admired Tolstoy for getting inside his characters' minds and for how it is people delude themselves. Anyway, you get the point. It's pretty unanimous. These two writers were and continue to be seen as possessing unparalleled psychological insight. Okay, but now the differences. And let me start with Dostoevsky first. So as anyone who's even read just a little bit of him knows, it's hard not to notice that Dostoevsky's world is very dark and feverish and extreme. His characters, like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, or the Brothers Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov, aren't calm and rational people, to say the least. No, they're torn apart by inner contradictions and by their dual natures. They're rocked by violent passions and by doubts that they can really hardly ever control. These are characters who are constantly struggling with their own sordid instincts like pride and despair and hatred and guilt. And they're often pushed to the edge, sometimes way beyond it, actually often way beyond it. And people in Dostoevsky's worldview, you can't really say that they're naturally good either. No, they have a dark and a destructive side, and it's very, very real. In fact, some of his greatest characters commit heinous crimes and sins, sometimes out of ideology, sometimes out of desperation, and sometimes just because they can't bear the burden of their own suffering. They doubt everything. They doubt morality, they doubt justice, they doubt society. And at the most extreme moments, they doubt even the existence of God himself. And yet, here's the thing, Dostoevsky never gives up on the human soul and its capacity for transformation. He believed that through suffering, through, as the saying goes, hitting absolute rock bottom, people could be changed and they could find redemption. In fact, for Dostoevsky, suffering wasn't just unfortunate. No, it was necessary. And that's because it's really only through agony and through humiliation and through being stripped of all delusion and self-deception that a person is finally ready to open themselves up to grace. So what Dostoevsky shows us is that even in the darkest corners of the human soul, even in the heart of a killer or the most extreme transgressor, the light of grace can flicker. It can survive. But, and this is important, redemption for him is never ultimately guaranteed. And like I said, it's absolutely never easy or automatic either. So, and this is the really important point, so Dostoevsky's Christianity then is not in any way benign. It's not peaceful or comforting. No, it's born out of profound doubt, out of wrestling with despair, and it's earned, if it's earned at all, in agony and heartache. For Dostoevsky, you have to suffer your way into salvation. Okay, now Tolstoy, by contrast, has a pretty different starting point. So I think he believed that human beings are naturally good, or at least that the core of us, if it's left unspoiled, aligns towards goodness. So it's not so much that people themselves are evil or corrupt. It's more like society corrupts them. What I mean is that society's institutions and its greed and its false ideologies and its vanity and its artifice, these are all forces that drag people away from their true nature, according to Tolstoy. So for Tolstoy, if the problem isn't deep within us but comes from the outside, then the answer is going to be different too. In his case, what you need to do, he thought, is basically strip away the lies, strip away the artificiality and the vanity and the indulgences, and instead live simply and love others honestly and work the land and raise your family and accept the basic rhythms of life, birth and work and death and the changing of seasons, and live with humility and an openness to faith. In Tolstoy's view then, and unlike Dostoevsky, truth and meaning aren't hidden in some dark labyrinth of suffering. No, they're simple, almost in a way self-evident. But the problem is that we constantly cover them up with social artifice and pride and ambition and illusion. And I should make it clear that I don't mean to say that for Tolstoy, meaning is found completely without struggle. Of course his characters struggle. I mean, War and Peace and Anna Karenina are full of people making mistakes and doubting themselves and struggling. But the key is that in Tolstoy, you don't need to suffer endlessly or commit some monstrous crime to find redemption. You don't need to be broken down to absolutely nothing. Often the progress comes through small, patient changes, a realization, a moment of honesty, or a quiet act of love. Actually, it's interesting. Even their writing styles reflect their philosophies, you could say. I mean, just scan a few pages of each and you'll see what I mean. Dostoevsky's writing feels chaotic and urgent, almost messy, and it's full of interruptions and wild speeches and sudden reversals. Reading Dostoevsky is like being inside the mind of somebody going through some kind of existential and spiritual crisis. In other words, the prose mirrors the emotional and psychological turbulence of the characters themselves. And actually, now that I think about it, maybe Dostoevsky's style is also partly this way because he dictated much of his work to his secretary, who eventually became his wife. I think that when you're free to speak the words out loud like that, with gestures and all, it's going to be reflected in the style of writing. But Tolstoy's writing, well, that's pretty much the opposite. It's much more grounded, it's patient, it's clear, crystalline almost, and it's structured, and it's wise. It's like a farmer telling you about how the seasons change. Even when Tolstoy is describing great battles or personal grief, there's a kind of steadiness to his tone, a kind of deep underlying trust that life has a stability and an order, even if we don't always sense it right away. But again, differences aside, ultimately, both writers, in their different ways, are calling us to something higher. They're telling us that the human spirit is not easily broken, despite the suffering that you're met with. That even when the world around us is confusing or corrupt, there is always a path, whether through agony or through simplicity, a path back to meaning, back to truth, back to life. And maybe that's the final gift that they leave us with. That no matter where we find ourselves, in the depths of despair or in the struggles of ordinary life, there is always a way forward. Bye for now.